Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel. In this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Moscow. Official statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry on the phone call between Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and US Secretary of State Rubio. On February 15th, at the initiative of the US side, a phone call took place between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Following up on the February 12th call between Russian and US presidents, the two diplomats agreed to maintain communication channels to address accumulated issues in Russian-American relations. So basically the focus is on removing sanctions, is on removing barriers between the United States of America and the Russian Federation. And most likely this is exactly what we are going to see during the next several days, weeks or months. When talking about Europe, here we can see completely different picture. For example, let's call it like one of the engines of Europe. French President Emmanuel Macron is convening European leaders for an emergency summit in Paris on Monday, according to Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski at the Munich Security Conference on Saturday. I'm very glad that President Macron has called our leaders to Paris, Sikorski said, adding that he expects the European leaders to discuss in a very serious fashion the challenges posed by US President Donald Trump. President Trump has a method of operating which the Russians call разведка боем, so which means reconnaissance through battle. You push and you see what happens, and then you change your position, and we need to respond, the Polish minister said. So we see that the world is changing, and we see that something special and something new we can expect during the next decades, and this most likely is going to be completely different picture that we've seen since the end of the Second World War. Now let's discuss several statements came from Ukraine, and the most important, another statement made by the special representative of the US, Kate Kellogg. In days or weeks, the US will present a plan to end the war in Ukraine, says Trump's special representative. And this is very important because most likely this plan that Kellogg is going to present most likely will be confirmed maybe for 80 or 90% by the Russian side. Then the Russians will make another step from their side to adjust this plan, and most likely then both the Russians and the Americans will agree and confirm this. So let's wait for this. The next week we are waiting for the meeting on the territory of Saudi Arabia, and then everything is going to become more or less clear. But something tells me that when talking about this agreement, this is going to be agreement between the United States of America and Russian Federation, where both sides, the Russians and the Americans, will decide, will create a mechanism how to finish the special military operation, which will probably include information about the participation of the US in this conflict, and will include information about limitations of areas where the Russians are going to act in the final stage of the special military operation. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground, because during the previous night we got a lot of very important updates, and the most important of them are coming from the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians launched another full-scale offensive operation, and most likely this offensive operation led to significant progress. At least this information was provided us by pro-Ukrainian sources. When summarizing everything before we start discussing the details and icons, the Russians during the previous 24 hours were attacking the Ukrainians from the settlement of Velika Novoselovka in the direction of Dnieproenergia. Furthermore, the Russians were attacking the settlement of Rozliv from the southwest. Furthermore, the Russians were attacking the settlement of Rozliv from the south and from the southeast. According to information we have, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to enter the settlement of Kostiantynivka from the southeast, and furthermore, several pro-Ukrainian sources reported that several Russian armored vehicles managed to go through the settlement of Constantinople and to land infantry in the southwestern part, let's say to block the Constantinople from the settlement of Bogatyr, so not to allow the Ukrainians to bring additional reinforcements and reserves. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to secure the settlement of Zelenovka completely, to cross the river of Mokry Yaly, and to take under control around 25% of the settlement of Ulakli, and most likely the pocket between Ulakli and Dachna was captured by the Russians or encircled with a significant number of Ukrainians inside of it. So this is like a short information of what's exactly what's happening. Now let's discuss everything in details. And first let's talk about Velika Novosilovka. During the previous nights, the pro-Ukrainian sources from Deep State, from neutral mappers confirmed, and from pro-Russian resources confirmed that the Russians managed to improve their position significantly on the Ukrainian side of the river of Mokraya Yali. Let's take a look at the changes on the map. So this is the situation by the end of the 15th of February, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 16th of February. As you can see, the Russians managed to cross the river and to take under control several true lines, fortifications on the Ukrainian side. And the most important piece of news is that the Russians managed to cross the river of Mokraya Yali in the area of the settlement of Acheretovate, Novo Acheretovate, and to take under control the first buildings in the southeastern part. So this is very important, because if the Russians manage to secure the territory of the settlement completely, from this area the Russians will be able to begin outflanking of the company's stronghold in the direction of Burlatska. So the situation here is getting very difficult, as you can see. Furthermore, several sources reported that the Russians were attacking the settlement of Bagatyr using the road TO518, but when talking about this road to attack during the previous night, we haven't received anything that can confirm this, neither geolocation nor the post from any source like mappers, like pro-Ukrainian or neutral mappers. So as for now, the situation along a TO518 road is unclear. We are waiting for additional clarifications. Now let's discuss the situation in Kostiantynivka. So we have changes on the ground, but we have changes published just by pro-Ukrainian sources, by Deep State, and they confirm that the Russians attacked the settlement of Kostiantynivka, that the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt to enter the southeastern stronghold. This is like something like a stronghold, very powerful Ukrainian position, and the Ukrainians are saying that we are not sure whether the Russians managed to improve their positions, to take completely, to dig in deeper, to secure this territory. We just know that the Russians managed to reach these lines, managed to land infantry. The land infantry took under control positions, and then the Ukrainians began their own counterattacks. So as for now, there are still very heavy clashes in this area. Furthermore, the Ukrainians are saying that they managed to bring significant number of troopers, and that the troopers managed to secure the territory and to force the Russians to fall back. So as for now, we are keeping this area as a contested area, or the territory covered with the fog of war, until further clarifications. Once again, I'll remind you that the Russians are saying, the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians first answered, and then the second group moved further in the western direction with the purpose to take under control these farms and to block the southwestern part, to block the M15 road from, let's say, supply and support. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in Ulakli. As for this area, we have no doubts that the Russians managed to improve their positions, and furthermore, most likely the Russians managed to take up to 25% of Ulakli, and most likely this upcoming night, the village, so during the day and during the night between the 16th and the 17th of February, the village of Ulakli would be captured by the Russians completely. This information was confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources. They have adjusted the map without any doubts, without any hesitation. Furthermore, we have the same adjustments on the map published by different pro-Russian reliable resources, and the most important, we have video, we have geolocations that confirm the Russian progress in this area, that the Russians launched full-scale offensive operation. We have several points, several positions where the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russian units. So there is a very long video, and we have lots of geolocations, lots of episodes in this video. Several of them were geolocated. One of the strikes took place in this point, another one took place. So based on these two videos, we have adjusted the fields. Basically, we have adjusted the contested area in Russian favor. Now let's compare the map between the dates. This is the situation by the end of the 15th of February. The Russians were very far from the settlement of Ulakli. The settlement of Kostiantynivka was under complete Ukrainian control. And by the beginning of the 16th of February, we see complete completely different picture. The Russians most likely answer the southeastern part of Konstantinopel, and most likely the Russians managed to secure up to 25% of the city of the town of Ulakli. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians, according to different Western sources, we see that most likely the pockets to the east of Ulakli was completely captured. So summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that everything to the east of Ulakli, everything to the east of this red line was already taken by the Russians during the previous night. The Ukrainians were forced to fall back. Either the Ukrainians were forced to fall back or they were caught in cauldron. So the situation for the Ukrainians is very difficult. Now let's discuss another important information. Different statements, let's say from the soldiers on the ground, from those from the Ukrainian side who was involved in this operation. On February 15th, the Russians carried out assault operations in the direction of Constantinople and Ulakli. From the very morning, Russian equipment began to roll on these settlements. It is difficult to calculate the exact number of equipment involved in Constantinople, as it varies from 20 to 37. It's just about Constantinople. There is no talk about Ulakli. Videos with damage will appear soon, and it will be possible to calculate, but the bulk of the equipment was destroyed. The infantry of the Russian armed forces concentrated on the southern outskirts of Constantinople, as well as in the area of the forest belt near point 127. So this is the elevation, the biggest, the highest elevation. One armored personnel carrier managed to pass through the village, and went out onto the road to Bogatyr, landed infantry, and was hit during the retreat. So we are talking about this episode when somebody managed to get this part to block the road and to basically caught the Ukrainians in Constantinople in cauldron. If the Russians are able to hold these positions, it doesn't matter whether the Ukrainians manage to restore control with the southeastern part or not. These Ukrainians are caught in cauldron. Another important detail is that Constantinople has been partially cleared. That was stated by the Ukrainian. Stabilization operations are going. It is likely that the Russian armed forces will not be allowed to gain a foothold there for the time being. So this is the situation. Another important statement was made by the 46th Air Mobile Brigade, that basically is the core of defense of the armed forces of Ukraine in this area. They also stated that a very difficult day, the most difficult since the withdrawal from Kurakhova, many other important statements, and the most important paragraph is this one. Let's discuss this paragraph in details. The purpose of the offensive was to cover the disruption of the transfer of two divisions of the 8th Army, the 20th Division and 115th Motor Rifle Separate Division, to the Toretsk direction, which had previously operated on the northern face of Novopavlovsk direction. In this regard, it is necessary to expect that the Russians to switch to active operations behind Toretsk and an offensive in the direction of Kostiantynivka. So the Ukrainians are saying that this attack that was carried out by the Russians yesterday had the purpose not to cut the salient, not to take under control, not to defeat the Ukrainians, not to take under control Kiev or something like this. The most important task of the Russians was to cover the redeployment of two brigades, the 20th, two divisions, the 20th Division and 115th Division. And according to Ukrainians from the 46th Brigade, these two brigades were operating in Novopavlovsk direction. So this is the area where these two divisions were operating, and these two divisions were moving in Novopavlovka direction. So I'm not saying that the Russians are going to stop in this area, but the Ukrainians are saying that these two divisions were redeployed in the direction of Toretsk. So as for now, I'm not sure that the Ukrainians meant that the Russians are going to attack from the city of Toretsk to Kostiantynivka itself. We believe that some of these redeployed forces will be moved in the direction of Vozdvizhenka, and these forces will begin advance along M32 road in the direction of Kliban-Bytska water reservoir and Konstantinovka itself. So that was the main purpose of this attack. So, but of course, if we remove forces, this means that the Russians will be forced to slow down. We can't say that the Russians are going to slow down, because during the previous 24 hours we got additional changes on the ground. For example, in this map we see the situation by the end of the 15th of February, and this is the situation by the beginning of 16th. According to different resources, mainly pro-Ukrainian, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the direction of Preobrazhenka from the southeast and from the northeast. So the Russians are moving. So how the Russians are going to continue if they redeploy 2 divisions? First of all, the Russians indeed supposed, and they they believes, and I believe that they want to cut the salient, of course, to take under control completely the settlement of Dachne, Ulakli, Konstantinopol, Rozliv, Bogatyr, Andreevka, so to take everything inside of this red line, and if the Russians are able to do this, then they will be able to shorten the lines. So I believe that the Russians calculated if they're able to cut this pocket, to cut these settlements, to defeat the Ukrainians, then they will be able to reduce the number of forces they need to continue advancing further in the direction of Zaporozhye and Dnipro regions. And these 3 forces, the force they will be able to free, they will redeploy in the direction of Dnipro, in the direction of Novopavlovsk. So they will just optimize the number of forces they are using in this area, because as I understand now, the Russians realize that they have too big army for this offensive. Now it's better for them to redeploy some forces in this area, because this is the next target, and this is the area where the Russians, as I understand, and the Ukrainians are going to have the general battle, the battle that will probably resolve everything, the battle that will give us the answer how exactly the truce and peace agreement are going to be signed between Ukraine or Russia. I'm talking about whether the agreement is going to be signed in Ukrainian favor or in Russian favor. Another important update is coming from the city of Pokrovsk. According to information we have from notes on mappers, indeed the Ukrainians managed to restore control over at least 50% of Kotlina. So we're talking about village itself in the industrial zone. So this information was provided us by neutral mappers. The Russians from their side managed to improve their positions and to take under control few more blocks, few more streets of the settlement of Udachne. So the Russians are moving in the western direction without stop. Furthermore, according to information we have, when talking about pro-Russian resources, the Russians reported that as a result of counterattacks, they managed to restore completely the settlement of Pishane. As for now, we are not adjusting the map. We are waiting for additional clarifications, maybe videos, but most likely this happens because this happened because the Russians understand the value of Pishane and the value of supply roads they need to support their force in Kotlina and Udachne. As you can see, Ukrainians, due to the fact that the Russians were cut from supply, lost up to 50% of Kotlin. So they understand if the situation continues, they will lose the entire village, and most likely they would be forced to fall back from Udachne. So that's why the Russians will fight for Pishane without counting losses, this obviously. And of course the city of Toretsk, the city of Kostiantynivka, the situation is very difficult. As you can understand, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians reinforced this area, so we need to expect that in a day, or no, not in a day, probably in 1 week or in 2 weeks, the Russians will intensify their activities significantly. They will continue offensive, and I believe that during the next 2 weeks the Russians will take few more villages, but these villages would be taken by the Russians, let's say by these Russian armies that are currently located here. But when the Russians finish the regrouping, they will intensify activities, and something tells me that the battle for Kostiantynivka is going to start very, very soon. Most likely during the early spring, we're going to see first Russian soldiers on the outskirts of the settlement. And that's it for the short video. Military summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.